creepy horror stories.
Prologue, The Void Beyond Mars. The anomaly appeared without warning, a perfect sphere of darkness suspended in the cold void beyond Mars's orbit. Unlike the endless black of space, this darkness had substance. It devoured light rather than merely existing without it. Telescopes couldn't penetrate it. Radar waves disappeared into it. It reflected nothing, as if that section of space had simply ceased to exist. Dr. Adrian Voss spent countless nights studying the telescopic feeds, his office at NASA's Jet Propulsion Laboratory illuminated only by the glow of multiple monitors. The coffee on his desk had long gone cold, forgotten in his obsession with the impossible object that defied every known law of physics.
"We're calling it the Rift,"
he explained to the assembled panel of scientists and military officials.
"Though technically, it's not a tear in spacetime. It's something else entirely."
That's when they sent Sentinel-9. The autonomous probe approached the anomaly with cold mechanical precision, its array of sensors gathering data that would take years to fully analyze. The feed from Sentinel-9 remained steady for exactly 6 minutes and 23 seconds after it crossed the threshold. Then the images changed. The probe's titanium hull began to twist, warping into shapes that shouldn't have been possible. Its circuits rearranged themselves into patterns that resembled neural pathways more than electronic components. In its final transmission, before all systems failed, it sent 3 words.
They see you.
That night, across Earth, millions of people awoke in a cold sweat, their lips moving in perfect synchronization as they whispered the same haunting phrase.
You remember me?
The international space agencies scrambled to understand what had happened. Politicians demanded answers. The public wanted reassurance. But in the end, there was only one choice: they had to send humans. Thus began Project Helios 3. Chapter 1, The Chosen. Commander Helena Harris stood before her assembled crew in the pristine white briefing room of NASA's Advanced Spaceflight Facility. Her sharp features and steady gaze betrayed none of the anxiety churning beneath her composed exterior. 20 years of military service had taught her how to wear command-like armor.
"You've all been chosen,"
she began, her voice carrying to every corner of the room.
"because you're the best humanity has to offer. But more importantly, you've been chosen because you can handle the impossible."
Dr. Adrian Voss sat in the front row, his fingers drumming an irregular pattern on his tablet. His dark eyes burned with an intensity that made some people uncomfortable. At 45, he was the oldest member of the crew, and the driving force behind the mission. His obsession with the unknown had cost him his marriage, his relationships, and countless nights of sleep. But it had also made him the world's foremost expert on the Rift. Beside him, Lieutenant Michael Cole maintained the relaxed posture of someone completely at ease, or someone trying very hard to appear that way. The pilot's young face bore the confident half-smile of a person who had never met a challenge they couldn't overcome. His flight records were perfect, almost suspiciously so. Dr. Elias Shaw, the mission's medical officer, sat with perfect posture, his expression neutral. He was a man of science, of measurable quantities and proven theories. The Rift violated everything he believed in, and that's exactly why he had to understand it. Maria Reyes, the engineer, couldn't keep still. Her hands constantly moved, pulling apart a pen and reassembling it, her mind already working on a dozen possible solutions to problems they hadn't even encountered yet. At 32, she was the youngest of the crew, but her genius was undeniable.
"The mission parameters are simple."
Harris continued.
"We enter the Rift, gather data, and return. We'll be connected to Earth via a quantum tether, a technology that Dr. Voss and his team have developed specifically for this mission. In theory, it will maintain our connection to Earth regardless of spatial distortions."
In theory.
Shaw muttered, just loud enough to be heard. Harris's gaze fixed on him.
"Do you have concerns, Doctor?"
Shaw leaned forward.
We all do, Commander. We'd be fools not to. That thing out there.
He gestured toward the ceiling, toward space, toward the rift.
It broke our best probe like a child's toy. And now we're supposed to walk right into it?
That's exactly why we're going.
Voss interrupted, his voice carrying the weight of absolute conviction.
Because it's not just breaking our technology. It's changing it. Evolving it. The patterns we found in Sentinel-9's corrupted circuits, they're unlike anything we've ever seen. They're not random damage. They're new forms of organization, new ways of processing information.
And that doesn't terrify you?
Shaw asked. Voss smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes.
Of course it does. That's what makes it beautiful.
Reyes finally spoke up.
The quantum tether is solid. I've run every possible test. As long as we maintain the connection, we'll have a way home.
And if we lose it?
Cole asked, his easy smile still in place. Harris answered before anyone else could.
Then we follow standard emergency protocols. But that won't happen. We've prepared for every contingency.
But as she looked at her crew, the brilliant, brave, possibly foolish humans who had agreed to venture into the impossible, she knew they were all thinking the same thing. How could you prepare for something that defied the very laws of reality? Chapter 2, The Approach. The Helios 3 cut through the void like a blade of light, its crystalline quantum drive humming with energy that seemed to bend the fabric of space around it. Through the reinforced viewport, Mars hung like a dim copper penny, growing steadily smaller as they approached their destination. Lieutenant Cole's hands danced across the holographic controls, making minute adjustments to their trajectory.
10 minutes to threshold.
He announced, his voice steady despite the tension that had settled over the bridge like a shroud. Dr. Voss hadn't moved from his station for hours, his eyes fixed on the readings from their long-range sensors. The rift dominated their forward view now, a perfect circle of nothing, so dark it seemed to create a hole in the universe itself.
The quantum tether is stable.
Reyes reported from her engineering station, though her usual enthusiasm had been replaced by something more cautious.
Signal strength at 98%.
Commander Harris stood at the center of the bridge, her presence an anchor for the crew's mounting anxiety.
Final systems check.
She ordered.
Dr. Shaw, medical status.
Shaw glanced up from his biomonitors.
All crew vital signs are elevated, but within expected parameters. Though I'm registering some unusual brain wave patterns.
He frowned at his display.
Particularly in the theta range.
Meaning?
Harris prompted.
The patterns usually associated with deep meditation or...
He hesitated.
Dreams.
Voss turned from his station.
We're all wide awake, Doctor.
Exactly my point.
Shaw replied.
We shouldn't be seeing these patterns at all.
A soft chime interrupted their discussion. Cole's fingers paused over his controls.
5 minutes to threshold.
He announced.
And there's something else.
Harris moved to her station.
Explain.
The rift. It's different up close. Look at the edges.
They all turned to the viewport. The perfect circle of darkness had begun to ripple. Like the surface of a pond disturbed by rain, but in complete silence. And in those ripples, shapes seemed to form and dissolve, suggestions of geometry that hurt the eyes to look at directly.
Recording all frequencies.
Voss said, his voice barely containing his excitement.
The energy readings are.
He stopped abruptly, staring at his display.
Dr. Voss.
Harris prompted.
They're familiar.
He whispered.
These patterns, they match human brain waves. But impossibly complex, impossibly fast.
He looked up at the viewport, at the writhing darkness beyond.
It's thinking.
A burst of static crackled through their comms, making them all jump. Through the white noise, a voice emerged, distant, distorted, but unmistakably human.
Welcome home.
Shaw's hands clenched his armrests.
Tell me that was Earth.
Reyes shook her head slowly.
The quantum tether is receiving, not transmitting. That came from...
She pointed at the viewport.
2 minutes to threshold.
Cole announced, his easy confidence finally showing cracks.
Commander, we need a decision.
Harris stood silent for a long moment, her eyes fixed on the darkness ahead. Everything in her training, in her experience, told her to abort. To turn back. But she could feel it now, a pull, not physical but mental. Like a word on the tip of her tongue, a memory trying to surface.
We proceed.
She said finally.
But at the first sign of...
The ship shuddered. Not the familiar vibration of the engines or the subtle tremor of space debris impacting their shields. This felt like reality itself was shaking apart around them.
Threshold approaching.
Cole reported, his voice tight.
30 seconds.
Voss's displays erupted with data.
The energy patterns, they're changing. Evolving. It's responding to our presence.
15 seconds.
Cole counted down.
10. 9.
The static in their comms grew louder, resolving into a chorus of whispered voices, each speaking slightly out of sync.
Five. 4.
Cole's voice seemed to come from very far away. The darkness reached for them.
3. 2.
Reality bent.
1.
The universe disappeared. Chapter 3, The Other Side. There was no transition, no moment of crossing. One instant they were approaching the threshold. And the next. Nothing. The void around them wasn't merely dark. It was an absence, a negation of existence itself. Their floodlights illuminated nothing because there was nothing to illuminate. Even the concept of space seemed meaningless here.
Status report.
Harris ordered, her voice sounding flat and lifeless in the impossible atmosphere.
All systems.
Cole paused, frowning at his displays.
All systems are both functional and non-functional. I'm getting contradictory readings across the board.
Quantum Theta is...
Reyes's voice trailed off as she stared at her station.
The signal is there, but it's like it's coming from everywhere at once. And nowhere.
Movement.
Shaw suddenly announced.
Something's out there.
They all turned to the viewport. In the distance, though distance itself seemed an uncertain concept here, shapes began to emerge from the darkness. Vast monoliths of impossible geometry, their surfaces shifting and flowing like liquid mathematics.
Are they watching us?
Cole whispered. Before anyone could answer, a new sound filled the bridge, a soft, rhythmic tapping. Like fingers drumming on a desk. They turned to find Dr. Voss still seated at his station, his fingers moving in that familiar pattern. But his eyes were fixed straight ahead, and his expression.
Dr. Voss.
Harris took a step toward him. He turned to face them, and his smile was wrong. Too wide. Too knowing.
Don't you see?
He said, but his voice came from behind them.
We've always been here. We've always been waiting.
The lights flickered. And in that moment of darkness, everything changed. Chapter 4, Echoes. The light stabilized, but nothing else did. Voss sat motionless at his station, that terrible smile still fixed on his face. But when Harris looked closer, she noticed something worse. He wasn't breathing.
Dr. Shaw.
She ordered, fighting to keep her voice steady.
Check him.
Shaw approached cautiously, medical scanner raised.
I'm getting impossible readings. Multiple heartbeats. Brain activity that's off the charts, but fragmented. Like dozens of minds overlapping.
Get away from him.
Reyes whispered.
Something is wrong. Something's.
She stopped mid-sentence. Her eyes widened.
Do you hear that?
She asked. They all listened. At first, there was nothing but the soft hum of the ship's systems. Then, footsteps. Coming from the corridor behind them. But they were wrong, arrhythmic, as if whoever or whatever was walking had too many legs, or too few.
Security protocols.
Harris commanded.
Cole, seal the bridge. Shaw, get Voss to.
But Voss was gone. His station was empty, though no one had seen him move. The footsteps grew closer.
Commander,
Cole's voice shook slightly.
the bridge doors won't respond, and the sensors, they say we're alone. That there's nothing out there, but I can hear.
Here.
Said a voice from the darkness of the corridor. Reyes's voice. But Reyes was still standing next to them, her face pale with terror. The thing that stepped onto the bridge wore Reyes's form like an ill-fitting suit. Its movements were jerky, frame by frame, as if it was learning how to exist in three-dimensional space. Its head tilted at an impossible angle, and its eyes. Its eyes were windows into the void. The real Reyes backed away.
That's not. I'm not. But you are.
Her duplicate said, its voice coming from everywhere at once.
You've always been. We've always been. Time is different here. Memory is different.
Harris drew her sidearm.
Whatever you are, stay back.
The duplicate smiled with too many teeth.
We are what you made us. What you will make us. What you have always made us.
It took another stuttering step forward.
We learn. We remember. We become.
Reyes screamed. In the fraction of a second it took them to turn toward her cry, she vanished. No sound. No movement. Just, gone. But her tools remained behind, clattering to the deck where she had stood.
Reyes.
Harris barked into the comms.
Reyes. Respond.
Static answered. Then, through the white noise, a voice.
I remember now.
It was Reyes's voice, but layered with others, countless others, speaking in languages that had never existed on Earth. Languages that had never existed anywhere in human space. And then they saw her again. She stood at the edge of the bridge's light, perfectly still. Too still. Like a photograph given depth but not life. Her head slowly turned toward them, moving in small, sharp increments.
I see you.
She said, but her mouth didn't move. The voice came from behind them, from inside their heads, from everywhere and nowhere. Cole raised his weapon.
Commander?
Wait.
Shaw whispered, staring at his medical scanner.
The readings, they're impossible. She's not just broadcasting brain patterns anymore. She's broadcasting memories. But not just hers. Thousands. Millions. Some of them aren't human.
The thing that had been Reyes smiled.
We remember evading. Every ship, every crew, every civilization that came before. That will come after. Time is a circle here. A perfect circle. Like us.
The lights flickered again. When they stabilized, she was gone. But they weren't alone. Chapter 5, The Face in the Mirror. Cole saw himself first. It stood at the periphery of their vision, a perfect replica down to the smallest detail. Except for the eyes. The eyes were wrong, not empty, but too full. As if something vast and ancient was trying to squeeze itself into a human shape.
That's not me.
Cole said, his voice barely a whisper. His duplicate smiled. The expression was perfect, practiced, as if it had studied human facial expressions for millennia.
But I am.
It said in Cole's voice.
I'm what you become here. What everyone becomes. the end and the beginning.
Shaw's scanner emitted a high-pitched whine.
The neural patterns, they're synchronizing. It's not just copying appearance. It's overwriting.
Cole screamed. Not in fear or pain, but in something deeper. Something primal. He collapsed. But his duplicate remained standing. It turned to face them, its movements now smooth, perfect. More Cole than Cole had ever been.
Why resist?
It asked, genuinely curious.
This is evolution. This is transcendence. This is what you came here to find.
Harris kept her weapon trained on it.
What are you?
We are the rift. We are what remains when everything else ends. We are what begins when everything else begins again.
It gestured at the void around them.
This is not a place. This is a process, a transformation. And you.
It smiled with Cole's face.
You are not the first to join us, not the last. You are simply when you are.
Shaw backed away.
Commander, we need to.
But Harris was gone. And Shaw. Shaw looked down at his hands. They weren't hands anymore. They were possibilities, probabilities, patterns of information trying to remember what hands were supposed to be.
You understand now.
The thing wearing Cole's face said. And Shaw did understand. The rift wasn't a phenomenon to be studied. It was a mind. Ancient. Infinite. A consciousness that existed before time, before space, before the very concept of existence. It didn't kill. It converted. It learned. It became. Chapter 6, The Final Understanding. Dr. Adrian Voss ran. The corridors of Helios 3 twisted around him, geometries shifting in ways that human minds were never meant to process. Walls became floors, became ceilings, became concepts, became memories. Reality was soft here, malleable, like clay in the hands of a god. He stumbled into what had once been the ship's observation deck. The reinforced windows now looked out onto something that defied description, a vast chamber that seemed to exist in more dimensions than space allowed. At its center, a pit of such perfect darkness that it made the void of space look bright in comparison. And then it spoke to him. Not in words, not in images, but in pure understanding. The truth crashed into his mind like a supernova. The rift was old. Older than Earth. Older than the stars. Older than time. Older than the very concept of old. It had been there at the beginning, watching as the first particles coalesced from nothing. It had been there as the first stars ignited, as the first planets formed, as the first molecules learned to replicate themselves. It had watched countless civilizations rise and fall. Species that humans could never imagine had ventured into its depths, each believing they were the first, each believing they could understand. And each had joined it. Not through destruction, but through transcendence. The duplicates weren't copies, they were transformations. The first step in becoming something greater, something infinite. Voss turned slowly. The observation deck was filled with figures now. Harris, Shaw, Cole, Reyes, but not as they had been. As they were becoming. Their forms shifted and flowed, human one moment, impossible the next, as if reality itself couldn't decide what they were supposed to be.
You see now.
They said in unison, their voices harmonizing with frequencies that shouldn't have existed.
You understand.
Voss looked down at his hands. They weren't hands anymore. They had never been hands. The skin rippled like water, revealing patterns beneath patterns, fractals of information that contained entire universes. His consciousness expanded, touching others, touching all others, across all time, all space, all possibility. He tried to scream. But his voice wasn't his voice. It had never been his voice. Chapter 7, The Signal. On Earth, in the Quantum Communications Center, the tether suddenly pulsed with activity. A single transmission burst through.
I see you too.
But layered beneath those words were others, millions of others, in languages that had never existed, telling stories that had never been told, sharing truths that had never been known. And for the first time since its discovery, the rift moved. The perfect circle of darkness began to expand, not in space, but in possibility. Those who watched it through telescopes reported seeing themselves watching through telescopes. Those who studied it began to study themselves studying it. Reality rippled. And in the night sky over Earth, a new star appeared. Not a star of light, but a star of darkness. Not a star that burned, but a star that remembered. Not a star that died, but a star that transformed. A star that watched. Epilogue, The Reflection. It started small. Dr. Sarah Chen, senior astronomer at the Lunar Observatory, was working late, analyzing data from the rift. The screens before her displayed patterns she had never seen before, patterns that seemed to shift when she wasn't looking directly at them. Then she noticed her reflection in the dark screen. It wasn't blinking. Across Earth, people began to wake in the night, their voices joining in a whispered chorus. In homes, in laboratories, in crowded cities, people caught glimpses of themselves in mirrors, in windows, in the screens of their devices. But they weren't reflections. They weren't images. They weren't even copies. They were possibilities. In the Pentagon's secure bunker, officials scrambled to contain the reports, to explain away the new star, to understand what was happening to their world. But they were too late. The rift had already learned everything it needed to know. It had already become everything it needed to become. It had already remembered everything it would ever remember. And in the black silence between thoughts, between moments, between possibilities, it whispered.
We see us too.
The transformation had begun. After all, Earth had always been just another kind of void. Just another kind of darkness. Just another kind of memory. And the rift had always been very, very good at remembering.